Hello again, friends, and welcome back to Kingdom Tales. I'm Father Lee, and together we're reading The Tales of the Restoration by David and Karen Maines. This is the third book in their Kingdom Tales series. In one of our earlier stories, the authors reminded us that it's not enough for us to say the king's name. We also need to follow the king's ways. That's a hard thing for most of us, isn't it? When Jesus was asked, what does it mean for us to follow him? He said to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, and with all of your strength. And to love your neighbor as yourself. It's one thing for us to say those words together. But it's another thing entirely for us to do them while we walk side by side. Today's story is called Mudslinging. Mudslinging! The report came crackling over Central Radio Dispatch at Mercy Street Taxi Corps. Mudslinging! Play Plaza number 5. Hero, Little Child, and Amanda were touring the taxi headquarters. Since New Day Rising and the ousting of the enchanter, there was no need for an underground resistance. Now the taxi company was involved in rescue operations that could be carried out in broad daylight. The efficient, restored garage was a command center for the restoration. The report came crackling again. Mudslinging! Play Plaza number 5. Mudslinging! Play Plaza number 9. Hero groaned and hurried to the strategic planning map that was mounted high and filled the whole wall. Climbing the platform, he located the 2 trouble spots. In frustration, he slapped his hand against the map. Chaos, he mumbled, always happens after power-outs. He motioned to Amanda and to Little Child to join him on the scaffolding. The chief cabbie hastened to the map wall and looked up. Pendrant number 3 and pendrant number 4. What'd you expect? These were the pendrants that were energy futile in the power out, Hero explained. The chief pulled an alarm bar, sounding a loud signal. Trouble to the streets! Trouble to the streets! Hero stepped down from the platform and grasped his brother's shoulder. This is one of the reasons power-outs are dangerous to the city, Elsie. When the energy fails, some people act as though the enchanter still ruled. They panic. They forget king's ways. All the unplanned plazas have been scenes for recent mudslinging. For some reason, people start calling one another names and throwing dirt. By the time the garage was rumbling with the sound of doors slamming, engines firing, cabbies shouting, and tires squealing, Hero shouted at Amanda, "Take LC with you and go in the first taxi vanguard to Play Plaza number 5. I'll try to reach Ranger Commander." He was afraid this might happen. "And you," he pointed at Little Child as he backed away, "stay in the taxi, whatever happens. Don't get out in the streets. I'm warning you, you're liable to get mud right in the face." With that, Hero and the chief cabbie rushed away to jump into a command taxi. Its siren wailed. Its flashing lights began to rotate. "Over here!" shouted a cabbie to Amanda and Little Child. "Get a move on!" In short order, the yellow taxis were out onto the streets, each driver knowing exactly his or her place in the taxi vanguard, and each understanding his or her responsibility. Little Child sat tense in the back seat, watching out the windows for trouble. "Amanda, why do the people throw mud? This never happened in Great Park. People weren't cruel to one another there. How could this be the king's city if people threw dirt at one another?" Amanda leaned from the front seat where she was riding watchpoint beside the driver. "City ways, I guess. Something about the power going out. I'm not sure why, but I do know we'd better get all those play plazas landscaped and planted soon." One by one, the yellow taxis rounded a corner, dispersing into a large circle with the intent of moving slowly into and through the disorder. Littlechild was startled to see a mob of people gathering on opposite sides of the street outside an unfinished play plaza. Inside the stone walls, mounds of earth readied for trees and shrubs were piled along the walkways. Clods of dirt flew through the air. Crude signs had been hastily lettered and bobbed above the heads of the people. Power workers are saboteurs. The city that doesn't work. People raised their fists and shouted angrily at each other, "It's your fault!" A fistful of mud flew through the air. Flap! No, it's your fault. Power was better in the old days. More fistfuls of mud winged back across the street. Flap! Flap! People pushed each other and shoved, ducked, and jostled to be in the best slinging position. Littlechild was amazed to see mothers shouting from the curb, their children beside them. They screamed and slung mud while the boys and girls watched wide-eyed. Anger pulsed through the crowd, charged with catcalls and baiting. "Wait here," said Amanda as she opened the cab door. A roar of noise rushed in. She ducked a flying clod. "But it's dangerous out there," Littlechild replied. "Yeah," she shouted. "That's why I said to stay in the taxi." The door slammed and Littlechild watched as Amanda began to edge through the crowd. He could barely hear her cries. "These are not king's ways. No name-calling. No mudslinging." But she was swallowed up in the angry jostling. His heart pounding, Littlechild settled anxiously into the seat. The cabbie monitored dispatches over his radio, signaling his position. Then, at a command, "Taxis advance," drove slowly, parting the mob, breaking through the shouting crowd. The boy pressed his nose against the back window. A glob of mud hit the glass. Smack! He jerked his face back in surprise. Had someone flung dirt at him? The messy clods slid to the ground, and then a stooping form came running past, scooped up the mud, took aim, and whanged it back into the crowd. "Ha! Gotcha!" It was awful. How did rioting get stopped once it had started? Another mud ball hit the glass and splattered against the window. Splat! Littlechild was suddenly enraged. He wasn't doing anything wrong. Why were they throwing mud at him? He wanted to open his door, scoop up the dirt, and toss it himself. And where was Amanda? Meanwhile, the cabbie kept inching the taxi deeper into the fracas. This was the position that Littlechild could clearly see the opposing mobs, one on each side of the street. "You want dirt? You'll get dirt!" Splat, splat. And whoa, who was that? Who was the man in the middle of the street? That street cleaner with a cart and push brooms and shovels and a dustbin. What an odd, dangerous thing to be doing, cleaning the mud in the middle of the fight. How useless. The more he shoveled, the more mud landed in the street. The people screamed back and forth. "We know King's ways better than you know King's ways!" Whap! "No, we cite the king more than you cite the king!" Whap! In the middle of all of this, Littlechild could see that the man was wearing workman's dungarees, a flannel shirt, and a hard hat with steel-toed boots. As the boy watched, the street cleaner said nothing. He scarcely glanced about him. He just kept cleaning and sweeping and shoveling the mess. A fistful of mud hit the man in the chest. He neither shouted in anger or threw the dirt back at the crowd. He didn't even wipe the clinging filth from his shirt. A little girl, yelling "na na 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 na" as loudly as the adults beside her, got pushed from the curb, took a direct hit in the face, and started to howl. But the crowd was screaming so stridently they couldn't hear her. The street cleaner walked to her, with mud flying all around him, took her in his arms, pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket, and wiped the filth from her face. No words escaped his lips, but his searching eyes found the little girl's mother, who took her daughter, looked at the man for one long moment, and shamefacedly slipped out of the crowd and disappeared. Who was that man? Littlechild wondered to himself. The boy couldn't see his face because it was hidden behind the brim of the hard hat and the jostling commotion, but something seemed vaguely familiar about him. By now, the taxi vanguard had circled the entire play plaza and the crowd on the opposing sides. At a signal, the cab horns began to beep. Soon, the furious voices of the people were smothered by the chorus of taxi horns. Somewhere nearby, Littlechild thought he heard other voices were now echoing Amanda's cries. People! People of Bright City, these are not King's ways. These are not the ways of the King. With its siren wailing and its lights flashing, a command taxi pulled into the center of the street. Boldly, Ranger Commander emerged, tall and handsome, his dark gray streaked head above those of most of the people in the crowd. His eyes were stern, flashing displeasure. He raised his hands above his head, palms open and out, an appeal for reason. Then he turned round, facing the other side of the street. Seeing him, the people began to fall quiet. They ditched the mud from their hands. Their placards suddenly fell to the ground and were trampled underfoot in the hopes that no one would remember that they had just jutted and bobbed above the angry scene. The radio dispatch crackled. Play Plaza, number 9 is in a riot. Reposition, reposition. Amanda appeared breathless at the front door of the taxi. Ranger Commander will soon have Play Plaza number 5 under control. Let's see if we can help in the next pendrant. The cabbie gently beeped his horn, maneuvering the taxi backward through the crowd. The people were now standing with their shoulders hunched, their heads bent, and they yielded easily to the taxi. The strong voice of Ranger Commander could be heard through the window. The kingdom is any place people do the king's work and live by the king's ways. Littlechild searched the subdued and chastened mob to find the street cleaner, but the man was nowhere in sight. At Play Plaza number 9, the same angry scene greeted them. People shouting, signs bobbing, mud flying. Flap! Again, Amanda hastened from the taxi, giving the same warning to Littlechild. The radio crackled with signals. Again, 2 opposing camps lined opposite sides of the street. Again, globs of mud hit the taxi windows. The people shouted back and forth, "No, we're the king's people!" Whap! To his amazement, Littlechild saw another street cleaner in the middle of the street. Just like the first, he was pushing his broom, shoveling up, tossing clumps of dirt, scooping it into a bin in his cart, not saying a word. Wait, thought Littlechild. Was this another street cleaner, or was it the same man? It certainly looked like him. Same dungarees, same flannel shirt, same hard hat, and boots. Could it be? How had he moved his cart through the streets to this place of conflict and arrived before the taxi? Littlechild watched the street cleaner. He never shouted. He never threw back the clods of mud that hit him. A big man with an angry scowl stepped off the curb and shook his fist in the street cleaner's face. The street cleaner said nothing. He just looked silently for a long time at the giant of a man. Chants swirled around his head. No more power outs. No more power outs. Old ways are just as good. Then suddenly, the accuser thrust his threatening fist back into his pocket backed off, and ran out of the mob. Who was this street cleaner? Little child wondered again. And as the crowd swirled around the taxi, he forgot Amanda and Hero's warnings and opened the door to get a better look. First, he stood on the fender, rocking up and down, and then boosted himself higher onto the trunk. A clod hit him in the back, but he scarcely noticed. From this height, he could see the street cleaner standing absolutely still. Mud hit the man's cheek. At the impact, his hard hat tumbled into the street, and the man wiped blood from his eyes. Little child gasped. They were putting stones in the mud. And then he could see the man's hair, the gold glinting in the brown. Despite the turmoil of the people, the boy caught a full glimpse of the street cleaner's face. And at that, little child clambered from the taxi and pressed through the mob. "Make way! Make way!" He had to get closer. Without pausing to think, he stepped into the street beside the street cleaner. He did know this man. Little child fell at the man's feet, tears blinding his eyes. The street cleaner stopped sweeping, rested his broom against the cart, and drew the boy to full stature. He looked quietly at little child, and his eyes were filled with the greatest sadness that little child had ever seen. "Oh, lad," said the man, "and are you the only one standing by me to help clean up all this mudslinging?" Little child gulped and shook his head, yes. He grabbed a push broom and began to sweep beside the street cleaner. At first, the crowd jeered and aimed mud at the dustbin. Then, when neither the man nor the boy replied in kind, the mudslingers on both sides of the street threw mud at them. And as he had in Plaza number 5, the street cleaner guided a lost, frightened child to its parents, and after one long look and no words, the father lifted his child out of the dreadful melee and turned toward home. The shouts and the screams began to lessen. In silence, the street cleaner held out his hand, and a few people gave him their accusing placards, which he junked in the dustbin. Little child worked beside the street cleaner, and the man paused a moment to brush mud from the boy's shoulder. In return, little child did the same for him. Seeing this, several people in the crowd, as though coming to the senses, turned to one another and brushed away the clods of dirt. Only a few were still shouting, and then, as though thinking the same thought at the same time from both sides of the street, several people walked to the bin and ditched their placards. Some took brooms and shovels from the cart and began to clear away the dirt. A growing silence, a silence as still as the street cleaner's own, descended upon the crowd. Had they really been throwing mud at one another? How in Bright City had this begun? And why had it gone on so long? How had the anger become so hot and pitched? Little child looked again into the eyes of the man. Yes, the boy had seen him before, joyfully playing with the children of Great Park. He had seen him riding tall on the backs of the great elk as Ranger Commander in Mercy surveyed the forest. He had seen him dancing the steps of great celebration. He had seen him as the most beautiful of men, had heard his voice commanding the winds and the thunder. Little child had seen the lights in his eyes and known his laughter rolling out over all deepest forest, over Wildflower Wood, over the practice field and Mercy's cottage. That laughter that made every heart feel at peace, feel that all was well after all. It was the king who had endured Burning Place to lift the dark enchantment that held the city in the enchanter's power. Little child had never seen him as now, in disguise like a common street sweeper, his hands calloused from hard work, his face filthy with thrown dirt, pain shadowing his eyes. It was the king now cleaning up the mud the people of his kingdom had been slinging at one another. It was the king suffering silently the blows of dirt that fell on him. It was the king with a wound on his cheek. By now, the taxi vanguard had again circled the crowd, but this time there was no honking of horns. A quiet, heavy, and raw had already fallen. Standing in the middle of the street, surrounded by people who had been slinging mud at one another and shouting hateful words, little child could stay silent no longer. Truth, the words of truth, came pushing urgently out of his heart. People of the city, the king, your king, this man is the king. At that, the people looked at the man, and with their anger finally vented, they saw him and knew him and realized what they had done. And little child, unable to bear the shame he felt as witness to their deeds, rushed into the street cleaner's arms and sobbed, his nose made muddy by his tears rubbing against the dirt still on the man's dungaree bib and flannel shirt. The street cleaner embraced him, patted his head, and whispered softly so that only the boy could hear, "Hush now, hush, hush. You have cleaned the streets with me. Good job, my boy. Good job." And as little child wept, one by one, the members of the mob left Play Plaza number 9, trampling underfoot the placards which had so crudely declared, "We know the king's ways better than you."